Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari, and today I am going over all of the books I DNF'd in 2021. So if you were with me last year in 2020, I have struggled most of my life to DNF books. I have this fear that even if I don't like a book at the beginning, that something's going to change by the end of the book and it's going to turn out to be fantastic. Does this happen? Sure. Does it usually happen? No. And I'm not above hate reading books where I absolutely hate a book, but I want to finish it in order to give it a really, really bad review somewhere. Do you have to finish a book to give a review? Nah, but I feel better about it. But anyway, let's get into the DNFs from this year. Now, the first book I DNF'd this year was a book called The Widows. I don't have the authors of any of these books written down here in front of me, so I will put the covers over here if you're interested in the authors. This one, the writing style was just something I could not get into. It's one of those overly flowery, wordy writing styles where the author takes 20 words to say something you could probably say in 5 words. And just right off the bat, I would start zoning out in the middle of a sentence. And I was like, there's no way I can get through this book. It was also a book that came in a book box and I wasn't particularly interested in it to begin with, but I do try to make it a goal to read all of my book box books. Anyway, there wasn't anything super wrong with this. I just didn't agree with the writing style and I decided that I didn't need to read it if I didn't want to. Next up is a book called Small Silent Things, and I think I talked about this earlier and had a couple of discussions with people about why this isn't necessarily a bad book, it just wasn't a book for me. And in this book, the two main characters have been very traumatized by things in their past, and I hadn't really gotten far enough into the book to figure out what had caused the trauma necessarily, but both of them sexualized their trauma, and it made me really, really uncomfortable to read, that they would be having a panic attack or just a traumatic memory and then they would start masturbating. And I don't that doesn't necessarily make it a bad book, and I'm sure a lot of people deal with their trauma in sexual ways, but it just made me super fucking uncomfortable to read, and I was like, I'm not comfortable with this, I don't want to read it anymore, and I put it aside. But people have in my comments previously said that this is actually a really good book, so if that's something that doesn't really bother you, you might like this. The next book I got was another book box book. I think this is going to be a trend for a lot of these, and it's called The Hobbits of Tolkien, and it's really a supplementary book about just hobbits and Tolkien's universe. And I don't like Lord of the Rings, so this book was never really for me to begin with because I just don't care. But I tried to browse through it anyway, and the first chapter that I read had something to do with foot fetishes, and I was just like, nope. I don't need to read an entire chapter about hobbit feet and the sexualization of hobbit feet. I just don't need that in my life. Next up, I read Gone Without a Trace, and I think this might have been a book box book too. It seems like it. And this was a domestic thriller. Shh. This was a domestic thriller, and I am not a fan of domestic thrillers to begin with. And the main character was super creepy and stalkery with some boyfriend problems, and it was just I know where this is going. I looked up the ending to it and I was right. And it was just one of those things where it's like, I hate this. I don't want to read about this. I'm not going to really tell you like where it was going or anything like this, because that would be a huge spoiler. But let's just say that the main character had boyfriend problems, and it was very uncomfortable gaslighting levels of boyfriend issues that I had absolutely no interest in reading about. Next up, I read Machine Hood, which, guess what? It was a book box book. This came in a Strand book box, I believe. And this one actually was on the Goodreads Choice Sci-Fi. I think it got 20th place, but it was still on there. This one I didn't like because one of the major plots of it was anti-abortion due to a religious nature. And one of the characters didn't want to, or wanted to have an abortion because her and her husband could not afford a child. And the husband was like, absolutely not, I don't give you permission for an abortion because that's against our religion. And I was like, I don't like this. Like, there's a possibility that the book was good, but that was just not a subject matter that I was interested in exploring at the time, because I think men controlling what women can do with their bodies through legislation or religion is disgusting, and we have enough of that problem right now in like everyday life that I don't have any interest in reading about something like that in an escapist novel. Next up, another book box book, and this one was called The Lonely Hearts Hotel. And this one is a very straightforward reason why I wasn't comfortable continuing reading it. And it had a vivid on-page rape scene involving the sexual assault of an 11-year-old boy. And I understand using childhood sexual trauma as a plot device or a character development thing, but don't give me details of it on page, like, ever. I don't. That was so fucking uncomfortable. And I like started reading that scene and just went click. Nope. Nope, 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 nope. Next up was Oasis, and this is a young adult sci-fi, and the writing in this was some of the worst writing ever. It was so immature and very white saviory and a hint of racism in there. But yeah, that was just some painfully awful writing that I couldn't get behind. Next up was We Used to Be Friends. Was this a book box book? Probably. Oh yeah, I remember it now. This one just had tropes that I didn't like in it. It was like a young adult romance. It had tropes I didn't like in it. I wasn't really interested in reading it to begin with because it's a young adult contemporary romance, and I hate contemporary romance. So as soon as we got to a trope that I knew I didn't like, I was like, there's no point in me reading this because I am just going to dislike the book, and it's not fair to the author for me to rate and review a book where they didn't necessarily do anything wrong. It's just something that I don't like in my books. Next up is the Glasstown Game, and I know who this is by, Catherine M. Valenti. And this one is super interesting because I hated this book. It's like a story of the Bronte children. So you've got the 3 Bronte sisters who are famous authors, and then they have a brother who no one has ever heard of. And basically throughout this book, like the entire plot that at least I got through was how the brother was very big on, I'm the boy in the family, I'm the important one, the girls aren't worth anything. boys are better than girls, and it was just literally like drilling it into your head that boys are better than girls. And you know, like, you guys know who the Bronte sisters are, and you never even knew they had a brother, so you knew that it was going to turn around at the end and be like, no, boys aren't better than girls. Girls are just as good, if not better, than boys. But I could not get through hundreds of pages of girls suck and boys rule and I'm better than all of my sisters to get to that point. So I DNF'd it because I did not care. And I was like, okay, I don't like Catherine Invalente's writing. And then it turns out you're gonna see one of her books on my top 10 favorite books of the year. So I'm glad I gave her a second chance. Next up, I read The Last Story of Lena Lee, which I think was a Book of the Month book. I really think all of these are book box books. I know at least one of them's not, but most of them are. But this one was just, it was boring to begin with. This is like a contemporary about like a daughter-mother relationship, and we saw it from, I think, the perspective of both the daughter and the mother, and it might have been two timelines. It's been a while since I've read this, and then obviously I DNF'd it. But from what I remember of it, the daughter character treated her mother so horribly bad for absolutely no reason. And it was just like vitriol and hatred, and like I just hated the character. And why would I want to read an entire book from the perspective of a character who, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, treats her mother like shit? Like, and then I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, like her mother had died, and she was like cleaning out her apartment, and like she had never been nice to her mother in her entire fucking life. And then she's like cleaning out her mother's apartment after her mother had passed, and she's like, maybe I should have been nicer to my mom. It's like, no fucking shit. So yeah, I hated that. I would understand it more if like the mother was hateful to her daughter and then they didn't have a good relation because of that. But according to both like the mother's perspectives and the daughter's perspectives, the mother was a fantastic, loving, wonderful mother, and her daughter was just the worst child in the fucking universe for absolutely no reason. It's not even like a child, like into her adulthood, she was still super hateful to her mother, and her mother had done nothing to deserve any of this hate. Next up, you know it, it's another book box book, and that is Gork the Teenage Dragon. This one sounded fun when I picked it up, but in all actuality, oh fuck no. The stream of consciousness writing, it's like the stream of consciousness of a horny 16-year-old boy. Not super my thing. And the way he described boobs, dragon boobs, in one scene was so uncomfortable. After that, it's not a book box book. This was an ARC that I picked up from NetGalley called Beautiful Nightmare, and I actually really liked the cover of this, and I think that's why I grabbed it. And then I knew it was fantasy romance, so kind of interested in that. In actuality, I didn't get on well with the writing, and the main perspective character gave off like big Karen vibes. And I just didn't need that in my life. So we escorted it out, said, thank you NetGalley for the ARC. I'm DNFing this book because what the fuck. The next book, also not a book box book, yay, that was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this is, I know this is gonna get some strong reactions. A lot of people really, really liked Rebecca. It was just, it was not for me. So the writing style was a little over the top for me, a little too flowery, a little too descriptive of the area around, or little too descriptive of the setting. I think I read in like the 100 pages of this book that I got through the word rhododendron more than I have ever seen in my entire 36 years up to that point. So, writing style not for me. Also, I didn't like the main character. She was a human rug and just actively let everybody walk all over her. And I don't think there would have been a plot to the book if she just stood up for herself for a second or two. And I know that's kind of the point of her character, is to be so different than Rebecca. But I'm just not that kind of person, and I didn't really have any interest in reading the perspective of that kind of person. Next up, I read a book that I was super, super excited about from the description of it. This was another BookBox book, so we're back on this bullshit of the BookBox books. But I got this in a BookBox, I read the description of it, I was like, holy shit, this sounds so cool. Super excited to read it, picked it up right away. I had no idea what was going on, and I couldn't be bothered to figure out what was going on. After about like 150 pages, I was just like, I still have no idea what's going on in this universe. I don't care. Like, there is nothing at this point that has interested me enough to continue reading this. And I just put it down, and I'm done. Next up, I read a classic called The Flatulence, like hitting yourself. And it seemed to be about a couple who like argued all the time and would get into like verbal and physical altercations pretty much constantly, which honestly that's not super my cup of tea, but that's not what bothered me about the book. What bothered me about the book is the writing was probably the most pretentious thing I have ever read in my entire life. It was so hard to follow the story because it felt like the author had like written out a normal story about these argumentative people and then grabbed a thesaurus and like went through word by word and just found an SAT word to replace everything. It's like, no one writes like that. And could I understand it? Sure. But it took effort to understand, and the subject matter of the book didn't fit with the language of the book. So I stopped caring and DNF'd that one. And it wasn't a BookBox book. That's the dog. Excuse me for a moment. And the last book that I am going to talk about in this video is Defending a Serial Killer, which this was an arc from Edelweiss, and it was a it was a true crime book. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a true crime book about a lawyer who was assigned to defend a serial killer, and the idea of the book is, how do you defend somebody who you know is evil? except for the lawyer who wrote this autobiography or whatever is super transphobic. And he spends a good chunk of the book talking about how, because this serial killer is a cross-dresser, that is what makes him a serial killer. And I don't know how to break it to people that wearing women's clothes does not make you a serial killer, since there are very few women serial killers, and most of us wear women's clothes on a daily basis. So, but the fact that it sounded like a really cool premise that was just ruined by blatant and hateful and ignorant transphobia. I wasn't going to give the author any more support by continuing to read his book of trash, and I did end up giving it a very, very low rating and a very scathing review about the disgusting transphobia of the whole thing. So there you go. There were a handful more books that I did DNF, but they weren't, but I went into reading them expecting to DNF and get rid of a lot of them. It was just a try a chapter tag that I did, where I took a bunch of BookBox books that I had had for over a year, and I hadn't really found any interest in reading them yet. I read the first chapter of them and then decided, is this worth keeping? Is this something I'm going to be interested in, or should I just get rid of it? And so that one wasn't really like expecting to read the book the entire way through and then DNFing it. That was going into expecting to DNF it, so I'm not going to talk about those books in this video. I made an entire video about it, and I will link it up in the cards if you are interested in watching that. But yes, those are my DNFs for this year. Let me know any books that you DNF this year and tell me why you DNF them. Anyway, I will talk to you in the comments, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video.